Tonight, let's drift slowly into the quiet spaces of the past. Welcome, and thank you for being here, where curiosity drifts like dust in a sunbeam, where history exhales, where the world outside your headphones softens into a blur. Let this be a gentle place, a place where you can set down the weight of the day and wander with me through the moments that reshaped the human story. Not with urgency, not with fear, just calm, steady steps through time, like walking along a shoreline where each wave is another memory brushing against your feet. Some days in history arrive like thunder. They tear open the sky, they roar, they demand to be remembered. Others come as whispers, quiet, almost tender, but they linger in the corners of our world for centuries afterward. Whether loud or soft, violent or fragile, certain days leave marks on us. The kind you can't always see, but you can feel when you look closely enough at the way our world ended up becoming what it is. Tonight, that's what we're exploring. Not catastrophes for the sake of drama, not tragedies told for shock. Instead, this is a guided drift through understanding, through the fragile moments when the world as people knew it changed suddenly, almost without warning, and the course of human life bent in a new direction. These are the days that reshaped everything. Days when ordinary people woke up expecting an ordinary morning, and instead stepped into the kind of history that textbooks can barely capture. And we'll visit 6 of those days together. We'll wander into the moment when the sky itself grew dark, turning daylight into something eerie and primal, as if the heavens had exhaled a long, cold breath. A day when thousands looked up, unsure if the world was ending or simply transforming. We'll drift toward a day when a single spark, small, almost invisible, set off a chain reaction that forever altered the way nations saw power and survival. A moment where light itself carried the weight of fear and awe. We'll explore the day when the ground shook, not from nature, but from human ambition taken too far. A day that changed how societies thought about the balance between growth, greed, and the fragile earth beneath their feet. We'll step into a day when voices rose, not in violence, but in unity, and spilled into streets that had been silent for too long, reshaping what justice and identity would mean for generations. We'll visit the day when wires and signals carried the first hints of a new kind of world, one where information moved faster than thought, where the boundaries of distance quietly dissolved. And we'll come to the day when humanity looked back at itself, through the eye of a machine, realizing just how small, how delicate, and how astonishingly connected we truly are. Each of these days tells a story. Each one left a mark you can still trace across the present moment, across the buildings you pass, the cities you live in, the technology you hold, the freedoms you rely on, the fears you carry, and the hopes you chase. They're not just episodes in the past, they're quiet threads woven into the fabric of our lives. So as we step into this journey, let yourself slow down. Let your breathing soften. Let the world around you grow a little quieter. You don't need to hold on to anything from the day you've had. For the next while, you're simply floating. Through time, through memory, through the echoing chambers of human experience. There's no rush. History unfolds at its own pace, and tonight, it moves softly. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a vast landscape made of time. Hills and valleys carved from the choices and accidents of countless generations. The air is still. The horizon stretches endlessly. And all you need to do is listen. Because these days we're about to explore weren't just moments. They were turning points. They were breaths the world held before exhaling into something entirely new. If you find yourself enjoying this video, click like and subscribe to Planet of Echoes so we can keep making more just like these. And now, with the quiet settling around us, with your thoughts loosening like knots undone by gentle hands, we begin. Let's step into the first of these days, the day The sky went dark. The day Mount Tambora erupted, 1815. In the early days of April in the year 1815, the people living along the lush shores and volcanic ridges of Sumbawa Island felt something shifting beneath their feet, something old, something vast, something with a patience so ancient it moved like a thought the earth had been holding for 1,000 years. The ground didn't tremble at first. It hummed, as though a long-buried drum were being struck from within the planet's heart. Villagers paused in their work. Fishermen straightened up from their nets. Even the animals seemed to understand, twitching their ears toward the mountain that towered above them, Tambora. It had slept longer than memory. Generations had lived and died in its shadow, planting crops in its nutrient-rich soil, trusting its silence. But mountains are not always what they appear. Some are simply waiting. The first rumbles sounded like distant cannon fire. People looked toward the horizon, wondering if war had somehow reached their remote corner of the world. But there were no ships, no smoke, no soldiers. Only the mountain, its slopes shuddering with a reluctance that felt almost alive, as if it didn't want to wake, but couldn't keep sleeping. By the next day, the sound had changed. It was deeper now, resonant, the kind of sound that doesn't just vibrate through the air, but through the body itself. People pressed their hands against the earth and felt the pulse. Children whispered that something was knocking from the inside. No one knew that Tambora had been gathering strength for centuries, that magma had been building in its chambers, pressure rising grain by grain. And now, in the spring of 1815, the mountain exhaled. Not violently, not at first. It released a long, low breath of gas and ash, drifting skyward in gray plumes that curled like smoke from an incense bowl. The air grew warm and heavy. Birds fled. Dogs hid. The sky dimmed. And then, late in the night on April 10th, the world shook. But even shook feels too small a word. It wasn't a single jolt or thrust. It was nature unwinding, a slow uncoiling of force that had been compressed beyond the limits of time. People would later describe it as the sound of the earth splitting open. Others said it felt like the sky collapsing. Some swore they thought Judgment Day had arrived. Volcanoes don't explode the way stories tell it. They don't roar like dragons or burst like fireworks. A massive eruption is quieter at the very center, eerily so. It is the world inhaling, holding, and then releasing. A breath magnified beyond human comprehension. Tambora's breath tore through the night, sending a column of ash and gas, rising more than 40 kilometers into the sky, punching through the stratosphere as effortlessly as a hand through water. Lightning crackled through the column, weaving in and out of ash clouds as if the sky itself were trying to stitch the wound closed. Rocks, some the size of houses, fell from the heavens. Ash rained down in warm, gritty sheets. Darkness spread in every direction, swallowing villages, coastlines, forests. The sound traveled thousands of miles, echoing across islands and oceans. Sailors near Australia reported what they thought was cannon fire from an unseen battle.
British colonies in Java were shaken awake by the blast. The air for hundreds of miles vibrated with a pressure so intense that people clapped their hands over their ears and cried out, unable to understand whether the noise was outside or inside their skulls. By morning, darkness still lingered. Days should have brought light, but instead, the sun appeared only as a dim reddish disk struggling behind a veil of ash. People walked through a world muted into monochrome. Ash fell like snow, collecting in soft drifts on rooftops, sticking to eyelashes. Rivers ran gray, leaves sagged under the weight of dust. Even sound felt muffled, as though the world were speaking from underwater. And yet, amid the fear, there was something strangely beautiful. A beauty born from catastrophe, yes, but beauty nonetheless. The air glowed in muted golds and soft umbers. When the wind shifted, the ash shimmered like powdered moonlight. At night, when embers still popped along the mountain's flanks, the horizon flickered with a fiery halo, like a lantern placed behind a curtain. Those who lived close to Tambora endured horrors: hot ash flows, choking clouds, entire villages buried. But the reach of this eruption was far larger than anything they could imagine. The mountain had thrown out so much ash and sulfur into the atmosphere that the sky itself began to change.
Across the world, weather patterns shifted. Winds drifted unpredictably. Clouds formed in strange, lingering shapes. But it was the coolness that humankind first noticed, the subtle dip in temperature that crept across continents like a ghost. In North America, people woke one June morning to frost coating the fields. Birds fell from frozen tree branches. Farmers stared in disbelief at their withered crops, touched by ice in a month when the air should have been warm and heavy with summer. Lakes skimmed over with thin ice, even as the calendar insisted it was time for planting, not for winter coats. In Europe, cold rains fell for weeks. Rivers overflowed their banks. Livestock died in mud-soaked pastures. Wheat failed. Rye failed. Even sturdy root vegetables struggled. Bread became scarce. Prices soared. Families gathered around meager fires, shivering through nights that felt stolen from January. People wrote in their diaries that the world seemed confused, as if the seasons had forgotten their places. They called it the year without a summer. But even that name understates what Tambora had done. The ash cloud had wrapped the earth in a thin, translucent veil, scattering sunlight back into space. Days dimmed. Sunrises glowed strange shades of violet and orange, as though painted by a restless hand. Painters in Europe would one day capture those sunsets, their colors so vivid and unnatural that critics assumed exaggeration, never imagining that a mountain on the other side of the world had been their unseen muse. Crops continued to fail. Hunger led to desperation. In Switzerland, a young woman named Mary Shelley watched storms roll through the mountains day after day, the sky bruised purple, the air heavy with gloom. Trapped indoors by cold and rain, she began to imagine a world shaped by unnatural forces.
a spark of inspiration that would give birth to Frankenstein. Even literature shifted under Tambora's influence. Across New England, snow fell in August. Livestock perished. People left their homes, traveling west in search of land untouched by the cold. Families packed wagons, not because they wanted adventure, but because staying meant starvation. In China, monsoon patterns faltered, bringing drought in some regions and endless rain in others. Crops failed. Famine followed. Communities that had weathered centuries of hardship suddenly found themselves struggling against a climate turned hostile by an event they never witnessed. And yet none of these people, farmers, travelers, poets, children, knew the cause. They simply endured a year that felt like a prolonged shiver, a world off balance. Tambora had reduced itself by more than 1,000 meters in height. Its peak blasted away into the sky. Islands downwind of the eruption lay buried beneath ash. Entire cultures were displaced, their homes swallowed in gray silence. Survivors told stories of days so dark they couldn't see the hands in front of their faces, of nights lit only by the flashes of volcanic lightning, of the eerie quiet afterward when even the insects seemed stunned. But where there is ruin, there can also be reverence. Sailors far from the site wrote of sunsets that burned crimson as if the sky was remembering the fire of the mountain. Painters in Europe found themselves captivated by the haze that softened the horizon, turning ordinary landscapes into dreamlike scenes. And in the decades that followed, scientists learned to read the clues left behind, in tree rings, in ice cores, in atmospheric records. They discovered that the world's climate, so seemingly stable, is fragile enough to be shifted by a single mountain's sigh. Tambora didn't just erupt, it reminded humanity of scale. It whispered to us that the world we inhabit is not a quiet place, but a breathing, pulsing body, alive in ways we rarely notice. The people who lived through 1815 didn't know the term global climate event. They didn't know about atmospheric sulfur aerosols or volcanic forcing. All they knew was that something vast had happened, something that touched every shore, every field, every sky. A single mountain changed the world. And in its wake, we learned, slowly, quietly, almost reluctantly, just how interconnected the planet truly is, how delicate the balance of warmth and cold can be, how a moment in one corner of the earth can tipple outward until it touches the lives of millions. And just as mountains can rewrite the world in an instant, the sea holds its own stories, its own hidden catastrophes waiting to rise from the depths. Because disaster doesn't only fall from the sky or erupt from the earth, it sometimes surges upward from beneath the waves, carrying its own kind of silence, its own kind of upheaval. So, let's keep drifting. From the mountain's breath to the day the sea itself turned against the world.
The Halifax explosion, 1917. The morning of December 6, 1917, began the way winter mornings often do in Nova Scotia, softly, quietly, wrapped in a thin gray hush. Overnight, a gentle frost had settled across the harbor. Roofs glimmered faintly beneath the first touches of pale sunlight, and the air held that delicate crispness that comes only in the hours before a day wakes fully. Children trudged along icy paths, carrying their books, scarves tucked up to their noses as their breath formed tiny clouds that melted into the cold. Streetcars rattled along tracks, their wheels hissing against thin layers of frost. Fishermen prepared nets. Workers heading toward the docks stamped their feet to keep warm. It was the kind of morning where nothing feels urgent, where life moves at a slower rhythm. No one knew they were standing at the edge of a moment that would break the world open. Out on the water, two ships began their cautious approach toward each other, so slowly, so quietly, that their movements barely disturbed the surface of the harbor. The first was the SS Mont Blanc, a French vessel, heavy with cargo that no one on shore could see and few fully understood. Barrels of benzol, crates of picric acid, gun cotton, and TNT, enough explosive material to alter the map of the city if it ever unleashed its potential. The ship itself looked ordinary, but inside it carried the tension of 100 storms. The second ship, the Norwegian vessel SS Imo, was lighter, faster, and pressing against time. It had been delayed, was eager to leave the harbor, and was moving at a speed that made the Mont Blanc's crew uneasy. But the harbor lanes were narrow, the shoreline tight, and decisions had to be made in moments. Imagine these two ships as characters in a play written by fate, slowly gliding toward each other as the people of Halifax continued their morning routines, unaware that the water was holding its breath. As the ships drew closer, warning whistles pierced the cold air, echoing across the harbor. People on shore paid little attention. Ships shouted at each other all the time. It was a language the harbor spoke daily. But the tone was different this morning. The Mont Blanc tried to veer. The Imo tried to correct. Water churned beneath their hulls as each attempted to avoid the other. And then, inevitably, they met. Not violently, not dramatically, but with a scraping, grinding collision that sent a shudder through both ships. A sound like metal sighing. A sound that, under different circumstances, would have just been another maritime mishap. Barrels toppled, sparks flew, flames licked the deck of the Mont Blanc. For several seconds, everything remained strangely silent. People along the shoreline paused, squinting at the smoke beginning to coil upward. Dock workers shaded their eyes. Children on their way to school pointed, imagining it was simply a fire that the crews would soon contain. Even the crews themselves only had a heartbeat to realize what was happening. Because the Mont Blanc was burning from the outside inward, and inside that ship was enough explosive force to match the fury of the earth itself. The flames brightened. Black smoke thickened. The fire crackled and spread, feeding on chemicals that were never meant to meet sunlight. The Mont Blanc's crew shouted warnings, frantic, desperate, abandoning ship and lifeboats and paddling for shore while trying to make anyone who would listen understand what was coming. But most people didn't comprehend the danger. They didn't know what picric acid was. They didn't know how volatile tar-soaked fuses could be when exposed to flame. They saw a burning ship and assumed it was unfortunate, not apocalyptic. Crowds gathered, thousands of eyes turned toward the harbor, drawn by the rising plume of oily smoke.
In houses facing the water, families pressed to windows for a better view. Workers leaned forward on their shovels. Children clustered along fences. The world held its breath again, waiting for something, anything to explain what they were witnessing. And then, a moment of stillness. A strange, suspended silence fell across the harbor. Even the seagulls seemed to stop mid-flight. The air around the burning ship shimmered with heat. Smoke curled upward, twisting like dark ribbon. Time stretched thin. It was in that silence that the explosion arrived. Not with sound first, but with force, an almost invisible wall of pressure that tore outward in every direction. A blast so powerful that it lifted the Mont Blanc into a cloud of fire and shredded steel, pulverizing it in an instant. A sound followed, but calling it sound feels too small. It was a thunderclap, layered with every possible frequency. High, low, deep, resonant, vibrating through flesh, bone, and stone. A roar that raced across the water and up the streets, flattening everything in its path. The largest human-made explosion in history before the nuclear age. In a single instant, the center of Halifax vanished. Houses dissolved into splinters. Storefronts disappeared. People were thrown through the air as if gravity had forgotten them. The shockwave shattered windows miles away, some as far as Dartmouth, some across the harbor, some so distant that
People wouldn't learn what had happened until hours later. A column of white-hot fire rose from the water, wider than a city block and taller than the tallest buildings, carrying pieces of ship, wood, metal, and debris high into the sky. A mushroom cloud unfurled over the harbor, swirling in reds, blacks, and incandescent whites. It hovered like a storm that had been summoned from nowhere. When the shock wave passed, a second wave followed, a blast of wind so fierce it tore roofs from houses, hurled doors into streets, and stripped trees bare. People caught outdoors were knocked flat. Many never stood again. And then the sound faded, just like that, as if silence had reclaimed the city. Those who survived woke inside a world that barely resembled what it had been seconds before. Streets no longer had edges. Buildings tilted at impossible angles or lay folded upon themselves. Fires broke out everywhere. The harbor churned with waves created by the force of the explosion, rising and falling like the breath of something enormous. But in the midst of this destruction came something strange. Snow. Cold flakes drifted from the sky, mixing with ash and soot. They settled on collapsed roofs, on bent lampposts, on the shoulders of survivors stumbling through the ruins. The snow quieted the fires at the edges of the blast zone. It softened the jagged outlines of rubble. It gave the city an eerie stillness, like a photograph taken a moment too late. Smoke curled upward from shattered chimneys. The air tasted metallic. The sky remained gray. People began calling out for their families. Some crawled toward light through splintered beams. Others wandered, barefoot, dazed, carrying whatever they could find: blankets, pieces of doors, a single shoe. Horses wandered the streets without their carriages. Dogs sniffed the debris, whining. Children huddled together, their ears ringing,
And then, slowly, impossibly, heroism began to emerge from the shock. In a telegraph office not far from the blast, a telegraph operator, injured, half buried in debris, managed to send a message before his equipment failed. His voice trembled as he tapped the keys, but the words he sent reached other cities. Explosion Halifax. Large. Many wounded. Relief immediately. That message traveled across provinces, summoning help faster than Halifax could have hoped for. Doctors, some working from makeshift tables in the snow, treated wounds with whatever supplies they could salvage. Churches opened their doors as emergency shelters. People who had lost their own homes wandered into the streets offering blankets to others. A group of railway workers sprinted toward burning train cars, pulling passengers out through shattered windows. Nurses from nearby towns boarded trains as soon as the news reached them, arriving to scenes they could not have imagined, but refusing to turn away. There were stories of impossible courage. A woman who dug through the ruins of her house with bleeding hands until she found her children. A man who carried strangers on his back through knee-deep snow to the nearest clinic. Entire neighborhoods forming rescue chains, calling out into the debris, listening for faint responses. And through it all, the snow kept falling. Slow, gentle, softening the chaos. By nightfall, Halifax was a city transformed not just by devastation, but by a strange, solemn unity. Every person who survived shared the same shock, the same grief, the same disbelief. Entire blocks had been erased. Streets no longer had names, but the people, those still standing, moved through the broken landscape with a determination born from something deeper than fear. In the days that followed, help arrived from every direction. Trains brought doctors, blankets, food, lumber, candles, and bandages. Volunteers searched through the debris from dawn to dusk. But long after the fires were extinguished, long after the last body was found, long after the rubble was cleared, something lingered in Halifax. Not just the memory, not just the loss, but the reminder that a single moment, a collision on a winter morning, could reshape an entire city. That life could split into a before and an after, with barely a second of warning. That the quietness of a day says nothing about what it might hold. And yet, even in the darkest hours of that day, there was a sense of humanity shining through. People helping one another without hesitation, strangers becoming lifelines, communities knitting themselves back together through sheer will. Halifax rebuilt. It stood up from the ruins and learned to breathe again. But the echo of that moment remained, carried in stories passed down through families, in memorials overlooking the harbor, in the unspoken knowledge that safety is never guaranteed, but resilience is. History often changes with thunder and flame, but sometimes what stays with us is not the noise, but the breath that follows it. The collective inhale after catastrophe, the soft exhale of people choosing to rebuild, to care, to carry on. And now, we drift toward another kind of transformation, one not born from fire or steel, but from something almost invisible. Because sometimes history changes, not with fire, but with a breath.
The night the Black Death arrived in Europe, 1347. A moon hung low over the port of Messina, its cold glow turning the sea to liquid silver. Most nights the harbor sighed with the sleep of anchored ships
and the distant chatter of taverns closing their doors. But on this night, in 1347, the silence felt different, too thick, too expectant, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Long after the fishermen had gone home and even the stray cats had curled beneath crates, a lone ship drifted toward the breakwater, with no lanterns lit and no voices calling for docking lines. It moved with the slow certainty of something pushed not by the hands of men, but by fate itself. Those who later claimed to have seen it first insisted it looked almost ghostly. The vessel, a trading galleon known to frequent the ports of the Black Sea, glided in as though guided by invisible cords. Its sails hung limp, its oars, if there had been any rowers left to use them, were drawn up and useless. For a moment it seemed to hover just at the edge of the harbor, its hull creaking like a wearied traveler whispering its final confession. A night watchman, half asleep, squinted into the darkness, thinking he'd imagined the shape. But the ship kept coming. It bumped gently into the wooden pilings with a hollow sound. No one called out. No captain barked orders. No crew leaned over the side, waving to the dockhands. Only the gentle tap, tap, tap of rope against wood answered the watchman's nervous shouts. He approached with a torch raised high and the uneasy feeling that something wasn't right. There was always someone awake on a ship. Always, even at the worst of times. But this vessel, it breathed like a tomb. The watchman stepped onto the deck, the planks beneath him groaning faintly. He called out again, but the only reply was the soft scamper of something small, several small things, skittering across the shadows. Rats, more than he had ever seen. They poured through gaps in the wood like water escaping a broken cask. Their eyes glinted red in the firelight, and their bodies vanished as quickly as they appeared. He backed up, stumbling. The rats were too many, too bold. And then he saw it, what lay near the mainmast, a shape that had once been a sailor, one arm outstretched as though reaching for salvation, his face frozen in an expression that bore no peace. Dark boils clung to his neck, his chest, his thighs, bloated, cruel swelling beneath the skin. His lips were cracked, his eyes stared upward, unseeing. The watchman fled, leaving the torch rolling across the dock, sparks spilling out like frightened fireflies. By dawn, word had spread throughout Messina. The ship carried death. And whether anyone understood it in that moment or not, this night would be remembered as the moment Europe shifted. At first, the townspeople argued about what the crew had suffered. Some whispered it was a curse carried from the east. Others said it was a punishment for sins unnamed. A few, less dramatic and more practical, thought it a fever, perhaps one of those strange illnesses sailors brought back from far-off lands. But none of them could truly explain the darkness they felt in their bones, the prickling sense that something unseen had slipped past their defenses. The sick were removed from the ship, those few still breathing, and taken to makeshift shelters. Temporary, people said, just until we know what this is. But the temporary quickly became the permanent as the shelters filled. The remaining sailors died within hours. The harbor workers began falling ill next, and then their families. A merchant who had helped inspect the ship collapsed in the street the following morning, coughing black blood. His wife refused to leave his side, even as her neighbors begged her to keep her distance. Whispers moved faster than footsteps. They said, "It's in the air." "No, it's on the rats." "No, it's God's wrath." "No," said a priest, pale and shaking, "it is a trial." People told themselves stories to make sense of it, but none of their stories were as frightening as the truth. The sickness didn't need their explanations. It simply spread. From Messina, it traveled like a shadow, riding ships, carts, clothing, breath. Fleas aboard the rats leapt to new hosts, tiny creatures carrying destruction in their bites. Rats multiplied in warehouses, scurried beneath floorboards, hid in the hulls of merchant vessels leaving port. Traders carried spices, cloth, and unknowingly, the seeds of disaster. Every city that opened its gates to commerce opened them to the plague. But before the scale of it became clear, before Europe understood it was facing something far beyond a local calamity, life still clung to its routines. People tried to continue, pretending their world had not begun to unravel. A merchant named Dario was among the first to realize this was no ordinary sickness. He had spent his life navigating the delicate web of trade across the Mediterranean, watching ports rise and fall as fortunes shifted. He believed himself a man of logic, of patterns, of predictable outcomes.
But as he stood in his warehouse, watching his apprentices collapse one by one, he knew logic had abandoned him. His wife begged him to flee the city with her and their daughters. But how could he? Everything he owned was tied to Messina. His shipments, his contracts, his lifetime of work. Surely, he told himself, this would pass. Illness always did. But deep inside, he felt a quiet dread. Something irreversible had begun. A midwife named Elisabetta, known for her calm hands and warm voice, found herself called again and again to homes where the living were outnumbered by the dying. She moved through the streets like a figure suspended between two worlds, one of birth, one of death, and for the first time she felt unable to bridge them. She washed the faces of fevered children, whispered prayers over their beds, and tried to soothe mothers whose grief echoed through the narrow alleys like mourning bells. One evening, as she left a house where a mother had lost her newborn and husband within the same hour, Elisabetta stood in the doorway and looked down the street. Candles flickered behind shuttered windows. A dog barked in the distance. But beneath the familiar sounds, something was missing. Laughter, the simple, casual laughter of neighbors sharing the night air. It was as though the city had forgotten how to breathe. And then there was Father Tommaso, a priest who had served Messina for nearly 2 decades. He too had watched fevers come and go, had held hands of the dying, had murmured last rites over countless souls. But this felt different. Every morning he woke with a new tally of burials. Every night he fell asleep wondering whether he would wake again. He spent long hours in the church, kneeling before the altar, seeking answers. Was this a test, a cleansing, or something beyond the realm of divine explanation? He found no clarity, only a growing numbness. And yet he continued. Priests always continued. Their duty was not to understand, but to remain.
In the weeks that followed, the plague clung to Sicily and then leaped to the Italian mainland. It rode inland on caravans of grain. It crossed seas to Barcelona and Marseille. From there it slipped into the veins of Europe, spreading along trade routes that had once carried prosperity. Cities that had thrived for generations found themselves overwhelmed. Streets that once bustled with markets, festivals, and music now echoed with the sound of grief. Entire neighborhoods fell silent. Doors were marked with symbols warning others away. The smell of smoke lingered everywhere. People burned their belongings in desperate attempts to purify their homes. Those who survived the first wave told stories that blurred the line between reality and superstition. They spoke of carts rumbling through the dawn light carrying bodies to mass graves. They described nights when the only movement came from rats scurrying across abandoned marketplaces. They remembered the ringing of bells that never seemed to stop. Yet amid the ruin, life persisted in strange, unexpected ways. Fields went untilled because there were too few workers. Livestock wandered freely in villages where no one remained to tend them. But nature did not wait for human permission. Grass grew tall across empty courtyards. Ivy curled around stone arches. Wildflowers threaded through cracks in forgotten roads. What people saw as devastation, the earth understood simply as time. In the quiet that followed each wave of the plague, Europe listened to itself differently. The world felt slower, heavier, as though centuries of certainty had dissolved overnight. For generations, society had been anchored by a rigid order: serfs to lords, apprentices to masters, peasants to the land. But the plague unstitched that order with merciless efficiency. With so many laborers gone, their work became valuable, astonishingly so. Survivors negotiated higher wages, moved from village to village seeking better opportunities. Many refused to remain tied to the estates of feudal lords. A world that had once been immovable began to bend. Culture shifted too. Art, once devoted to grand biblical scenes and the lives of saints, grew darker, more reflective. People painted death not as an abstract spiritual concept, but as something intimate and immediate. Music took on a different tone, haunting, questioning, as though searching for meaning among the ashes. The plague reshaped families as well. Children who lost parents were taken in by distant relatives or neighbors, creating bonds that had never existed before. Entire communities reorganized themselves, adapting out of necessity, carving new roles from the ruins of the old. Years later, travelers passing through Europe would speak of the strange beauty of the abandoned places. Vine-covered monasteries where silence echoed through the cloisters. Market squares where trees sprouted between cobblestones. Once crowded ports where only the wind stirred the broken remains of wharves. It was as if the world had become a museum of its own collapse. But that beauty was fragile. It carried the memory of the night when the first ship drifted into Messina, bearing the terrible gift that would ripple outward in every direction. A single moment that sliced Europe's story into two, before and after. Dario's warehouse stood empty. Elisabetta's hands trembled each morning as she prepared water for cleaning. Father Tommaso lit candles until his fingers blistered. They were only three among millions whose lives were altered by an unseen enemy, yet their stories mirrored the continent's transformation. Loss, confusion, resilience, rebirth. They repeated across towns, across nations,
across generations. The Black Death did not just claim lives. It unraveled systems, rewrote norms, forced entire civilizations to look inward and ask questions they had once feared. What holds a society together? What breaks it? And what grows from the broken pieces? When people looked back on that moment in history, the ship under the moonlight, the eerie silence, the rats fleeing the shadows, they understood that centuries of progress, structure, and tradition could be undone in a single night. A reminder that no system, however grand, is immune to the forces that lie beyond sight. Europe would rebuild. It always did. But the scars remained, shaping the centuries to come in ways no one alive in 1347 could have imagined. And as the final embers of the plague years faded, one truth lingered like a whisper carried on the wind. Not every tragedy is written in lives. Some are written in knowledge.
The burning of the Library of Alexandria, 48 BCE. The city rose from the edge of the Mediterranean like a dream carved from sunlight. Alexandria, queen of the sea, the place where continents met and ideas mingled as effortlessly as the tide. On its shoreline stood the great lighthouse, Pharos, its marble columns shimmering beneath the morning sun, a beacon so brilliant sailors swore they could feel its light warming their skin long before they reached its harbor. To approach Alexandria in its glory was to feel as if you were stepping toward the center of the known world. Ships from every corner of the Mediterranean spilled into the harbor, their sails painted in colors and sigils that reflected their homelands. Greek merchants shouted to Phoenician sailors. Roman envoys brushed shoulders with Jewish scholars. Egyptian priests strode past students clutching scrolls. The city thrived on noise, on movement, on the constant hum of discovery. And at its heart stood the library. Not a simple building, but a constellation of knowledge, a palace of papyrus, wisdom, and wonder. Travelers who visited often confessed that nothing prepared them for the moment they first walked through its gates. They entered expecting a library. They left believing they had glimpsed the soul of humanity. The library grounds stretched across courtyards where fountains trickled gently, their mosaics glimmering beneath the water's surface. Gardens bloomed with plants collected from distant lands, herbs, flowers, trees, each labeled, studied, carefully tended. And beyond the gardens, the main halls rose in columns of pale stone, glowing gold in the afternoon light. Every inch of the place seemed to breathe intention, as though the architects had whispered into the walls, "Hold all that we are, protect everything we might become." Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of ink, parchment dust, and cedar. Sunlight filtered through small openings, catching dust motes that floated like stars in the half-light. And everywhere were scrolls, stacked floor to ceiling in niches carved into the walls, resting on long wooden tables where scholars hunched over them, rolled into bundles awaiting copying or translation. Some were fragile, flaking at the edges. Others were crisp and new, the ink still shining faintly. They numbered in the hundreds of thousands. If you walked softly through the main hall, you might hear the faint scratching of reed pens against parchment, the murmur of debate in Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, Latin, the gentle rustle of scrolls being unrolled by careful hands. There was something sacred in the sound, the quiet heartbeat of civilization. Visitors often said the library felt less like a place and more like a vessel carrying everything humanity had ever learned across the sea of time. Its floors had held the footsteps of Eratosthenes, who measured the earth with astonishing precision, using only shadows and geometry. They had echoed with the discussions of scholars who charted the stars, calculated distances between planets, studied the anatomy of animals, and recorded histories now long forgotten. Imagine walking past a room where cartographers debated the shape of the world, their maps spread out like tapestries across the tables. Nearby, astronomers traced arcs in the air, predicting eclipses centuries in advance. Poets recited verses preserved only in their memories, waiting for a scribe to immortalize them. Philosophers paced slowly, hands clasped behind their backs, whispering about the nature of existence. And now imagine that same world slowly catching fire. The tragedy of the Library of Alexandria was not a single night of destruction, not a blaze that consumed everything in one catastrophic moment. It was a series of losses, each one chipping away at the vast mountain of accumulated knowledge. Fires sparked by war, by accident, by political malice, by simple indifference. Layered tragedies that formed a tapestry of forgetting. Some say the first blow came when Julius Caesar set fire to the Egyptian fleet during the siege of Alexandria in 48 BCE. The flames leapt with the wind, catching nearby warehouses where scrolls were stored for trade and duplication. Tens of thousands of works vanished in those hours, works collected painstakingly from ships entering the harbor, seized not out of greed, but out of a belief that knowledge belonged to everyone. Others say the final destruction happened centuries later, under a regime that saw the library not as a sanctuary, but as a dangerous symbol of old ideas. Or when Christian zealotry, rising with imperial support, targeted pagan texts. Or when Arab conquerors inherited a collection already wounded by time and conflict, only to watch it crumble from neglect.
No one can say with certainty when the last scroll turned to ash. That mystery is its own quiet sorrow. But imagine one fire, just one. It doesn't matter which. Picture a scholar standing in a courtyard as smoke rises in the distance. He smells it before he sees it, the acrid bite of burning papyrus, dry and unmistakable. His legs move before his thoughts do. He runs toward the nearest hall, heart pounding against his ribs. But he's too late. Flames lick at the wooden beams. Scrolls that took decades to gather ignite in seconds. He thinks of the manuscript he has been working on for 20 years, a history of the ancient kingdoms of the Nile. His life's work, compiled from hundreds of interviews, translations, fragments. He claws at the door, but the heat drives him back. He stands helpless, tears carving tracks down a face lined by years of study. Around him, others watch their own contributions vanish.
A woman who studied the patterns of tides collapses to her knees as her charts turn to smoke. A young poet tries to save a handful of scrolls, only to be pulled back for his own safety. An old mathematician stares at the flames consuming the algorithms he spent a lifetime refining. It wasn't just knowledge lost, it was devotion, memory, identity. Entire civilizations crumbled quietly inside those flames. Histories of kingdoms we will never know. Plays more beautiful than anything that survived. Medical treatises that might have saved countless lives. Maps that revealed a world now forgotten. Myths from cultures erased before they were ever understood. Imagine astronomy texts describing constellations no longer visible. Mathematical proofs centuries ahead of their time. Anatomical drawings that could have advanced medicine by generations. Accounts of wars and treaties that shaped continents, now forever silent. And then imagine the simple things. A personal letter from a father to a daughter. A poem written by a young scholar dreaming of love. Notes from a physician observing a rare illness. Recipes, songs, legends told by sailors on distant shores. Knowledge doesn't burn evenly. Sometimes the greatest works survive by chance, while the small, intimate ones vanish without a trace. And sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes the world loses everything that truly mattered without ever realizing it. People later romanticized the library as a symbol of perfection, an untouchable paradise of wisdom. But what made it remarkable was not that it was flawless. It was alive. It was filled with argument, contradiction, curiosity. It welcomed anyone who sought to understand the world more deeply. It believed simply and profoundly that knowledge made humanity better. That belief is what burned. For centuries after its destruction, travelers wrote about the silence surrounding the site where the library once stood. They described the way the wind moved differently there, as if whispering the fragments of lost texts. They told of scholars who returned long after the fires died, unable to accept that the sanctuary of their youth had vanished. One such man, an aging historian named Theon, was said to have visited the ruins every morning. He would stand among the scattered stones, brushing dust from cracked floor tiles, as though searching for a scroll that might have been overlooked by fate. He'd sit beside a collapsed column and close his eyes, listening for echoes of debates that once filled the air. Sometimes he would speak softly, reciting lines from works that no longer existed. He did not do this out of madness, but out of mourning, for he knew the greatest tragedy was not simply the loss of knowledge, but the loss of memory, the unraveling of threads that connected past to present. The Library of Alexandria represented more than parchment and ink. It embodied the idea that humanity could gather itself, its questions, its discoveries, its stories, and preserve them for a future it would never see. The day it fell was the day humanity, in a sense, forgot itself. In the centuries that followed, new libraries would rise. New scholars would emerge. Knowledge would be rebuilt, rediscovered, reinvented. But the shadow of Alexandria remained, a reminder of how fragile wisdom truly is. A reminder that even the grandest achievements can vanish in a single night. If you close your eyes, you might imagine walking through its halls again.
the cool stone beneath your feet, the soft glow of sunlight on scrolls stacked higher than your head, the gentle murmur of scholars speaking across time, and somewhere in the background, the rustle of a page turning, a sound almost like a sigh. We think of fire as the destroyer, but forgetting is quieter, more patient, more dangerous. The library did not fall only to flames. It fell to the slow erosion of care, to shifting priorities, to the belief that knowledge could wait until tomorrow. There is a lesson in that, one that lingers like smoke in the air. Knowledge is as fragile as papyrus. It endures only when tended, copied, shared, protected. A single spark of neglect can undo centuries of brilliance. And sometimes the strangest tragedies happen not in ancient times, but in our own streets.
The Great Molasses Flood, 1919. The cold had settled over Boston like a heavy blanket, thick and unmoving. It was January of 1919, the kind of winter that crept into the bones of the city and lingered in every alleyway and on every doorstep. Ice clung to railings along Commercial Street. Horses exhaled white plumes of steam as they pulled carts across the cobblestones. Children trudged to school with chapped cheeks, their boots tapping out small, hollow rhythms in the morning quiet. And above all of this, above the shops, the warehouses, the scattered piles of snow, loomed a massive steel tank. It had been standing for only a few years, rising like an iron cliff near the waterfront, 50 feet tall, 90 feet across. A reservoir of dark, thick molasses meant for refining and distilling, meant to flow into factories and become alcohol for the war effort. People walked past it every day without thinking. It was simply there, ugly, enormous, but familiar. Yet there were whispers. The tank groaned. It moaned in the night. Sometimes children would press their ears to the metal and giggle at the deep, echoing noises inside, the strange whale song of stored sweetness, shifting and swelling with temperature. Workers complained that molasses leaked through the seams, dripping onto the ground in slow amber rivulets. Company officials brushed off the concerns. Steel was strong. Tanks were sturdy. No one worried too much about the rumblings of a structure that seemed too big to fail. But the cold was deceptive that winter. Bitter nights were followed by unusual warmth. Temperatures swung abruptly, freezing and thawing the contents of the tank until the molasses inside expanded and contracted, pushing against the riveted walls like a restless beast. On the morning of January 15th, the tank groaned louder than usual. People heard it. A few paused, a few frowned, but the noise had become such a regular presence that it blended into the city's soundscape. Horses, voices, footsteps, creaking wood, groaning steel. Life carried on. Then, just after noon, there was a sound that did not belong. Some would later describe it as a deep crack, like a tree splitting open. Others said it was more like gunfire, sharp and metallic. A few swore it sounded like the entire tank exhaled, one long guttural sigh. But one detail was the same in almost every account. There were a few seconds of silence afterward. A pause, a moment when the world seemed to hold its breath. And then the tank burst. There was no explosion, no fire, no violent roar. Instead, there was a tearing, a sudden, ripping collapse as steel plates peeled apart like wet paper.
Rivets shot through the air like bullets, the tank wall folded outward, and what had been contained within it surged forth in a dark, glistening wave. A wave of molasses. 50 feet high at its crest, moving faster than anyone expected something so thick could move. People called it a slow tsunami, but in truth it raced through the streets at nearly 35 miles per hour, devouring everything in its path. It glistened in the winter sunlight, brown and glossy and terrible, like some surreal force conjured from a dream. The sound of it was unlike anything the city had ever heard. A low, rumbling grind, half liquid, half avalanche. The syrup tore buildings from their foundations. It crushed freight cars. It wrapped around lampposts and snapped them like twigs. Horses screamed as the wave engulfed them, their hooves thrashing uselessly in the thick flood. And the smell was overwhelming. Sweet, cloying, warm even in the cold air. A scent of sugar and fermentation that coated the inside of the nose, the back of the throat, the lining of the lungs. A scent that would linger for decades in memory and for months in the city itself. For the people caught in the streets, the disaster felt unreal, like wading through dreams that had suddenly turned against them. Men were lifted off their feet, thrown against walls, pinned under debris. Children found themselves swept into alleyways, unable to escape the slow, suffocating pull of the molasses. One patrolman, thrown from his horse, struggled to stand, but sank chest deep into the brown flood. He clawed at the sticky surface, each movement sluggish, as though time had changed around him. Another man was trapped under a wagon, unable to free his legs from the molasses that clung like glue. A young boy who had been playing near the tank moments before disappeared under the wave entirely.
But even amid terror, there were acts of quiet heroism. As the flood settled into the streets, its force spent, but its danger far from over, rescuers arrived. Firefighters, police, civilians who ran toward the chaos instead of away. They found themselves stepping into a nightmare. Molasses had spread across several blocks, trapping victims beneath debris, pinning them against walls, filling basements and cellars with a thick, suffocating mass. Rescuers waded through it, some sinking up to their armpits, gripping ropes tied around their waists so they could be pulled free if they became stuck. Every step was an effort, each boot lifted with a wet, sucking sound. Clothing hardened with the sticky mixture, breath became a struggle. Firefighters used ladders as makeshift bridges across the thickest areas. They pulled survivors out by hand, sometimes only recognizing them by a flash of hair or a sleeve poking above the surface. Horses were freed if they could be freed. When they could not, they were gently put out of their misery. The city filled with the sound of axes striking wood, men shouting directions, the quiet sobs of those who realized loved ones were missing. And always that smell. A sweetness so strong it felt like drowning in syrup. As the day faded into evening, the temperature dropped. The molasses thickened further, hardening around debris like amber around insects. What had moved like water in the first moments had become something closer to concrete. Rescuers had to chip through it with shovels and hammers. Their faces were smeared with brown, their gloves stiff and useless. Horses used to help pull debris slipped repeatedly on the sticky ground. News spread quickly. By sunset, reporters and photographers arrived, their boots sticking to the cobblestones. The strange, surreal nature of the disaster left them struggling for words. How did one describe a flood not of water, but of sugar?
How did one capture the mixture of tragedy and absurdity, horror and disbelief? For days, the cleanup continued. Firefighters pumped seawater from the harbor to wash away the molasses, sending brown waves swirling into the ocean. Workers scraped the substance from walls, floors, and pavements. Some buildings had been so soaked by the syrup that they remained sticky months later. The local rum-making company lost its supply, but the neighborhood gained a scent that clung stubbornly to the air. People joked, in the uneasy way humans often cope with trauma, that everything tasted like molasses, the sidewalks, the air, even the rats. But beneath the jokes was a deeper understanding. Their city had been reshaped by something so mundane, so ordinary, that its transformation into a monster felt almost mythic. Families mourned lost relatives. The wounded healed slowly, many carrying scars, both physical and emotional, for the rest of their lives. Lawsuits followed, unraveling stories of negligence and ignored warnings. The company responsible for the tank eventually paid out hundreds of thousands of dollars in compensation, though no amount of money could restore what had been taken. In the quiet moments after the cleanup crews went home, when the streets were dark and still, some residents swore they could hear faint creaks where the tank once stood, as if the city itself remembered, as if steel, even after it was gone, left an echo. And years afterward, on warm summer days, the smell of molasses would rise faintly from the cracks in the pavement, a ghost of sweetness drifting through the air, a reminder that catastrophe doesn't always arrive with fire or thunder. Sometimes it comes with a sigh from a steel wall, with a groan no one takes seriously, with a slow, sticky wave that feels almost gentle until it isn't. Some tragedies reshape landscapes. This one reshaped the imagination of an entire city. People looked at mundane things, tanks, barrels, pipes, with new caution. They understood, in a way they never had before, that even everyday substances could become monstrous when neglected. It is a lesson both haunting and humble. Danger often sleeps in the most ordinary places. And years later, when memory had softened the edges of the disaster, people still told the story. They told it the way one tells a surreal dream, disbelief always lingering at the edges. A flood of molasses. It sounded impossible. Yet it happened, as real as stone, as real as winter. And then, decades later, there came a night when silence glowed.
The Chernobyl Disaster, 1986. The night was peaceful in northern Ukraine. The kind of peace that makes you forget the world can ever change. In the city of Pripyat, built for workers and families who had devoted their lives to the atom, apartment blocks stood illuminated by a gentle grid of street lamps. The sky above them was clear, a pale bowl of spring darkness. Windows glowed faintly with televisions left on low, radios humming lullabies, an occasional train rolling past the outskirts. It was late April, and the air carried just a hint of the thaw, cool, clean, and filled with the expectancy of a new season. Most of the city was asleep. A mother rested beside her newborn. A young couple argued softly about something trivial before laughing and turning out the light. A schoolboy dreamed of the soccer game he'd play in the courtyard the next afternoon. A man on night shift cycled lazily toward his post, his breath forming silver ghosts as he passed between pools of lamplight.
Nothing about this night suggested history would bend. It felt like any other. But just beyond the horizon, at the edge of the city, stood the power plant. 4 reactors lined up like immense dark monuments, their shapes barely visible against the sky. Reactor number 4, massive, angular, quiet, was preparing for a test that most assumed would be routine. Inside its control room, the atmosphere was not tense or dramatic. It was slow, methodical, filled with the soft clicking of instruments and the calm voices of men who had done this sort of thing countless times. The hum of machinery pulsed steadily through the walls, the kind of sound that becomes background music to those who work there long enough. The test was meant to be simple. Simulate a power outage to ensure that electricity could still feed the plant's safety systems. A procedure that required lowering the output of the reactor, turning off systems temporarily, checking responses. Yet the day had been filled with delays, unexpected shifts, orders from above, and decisions that nudged the schedule from daylight into deep night. Exhaustion hung over the room like a heavy curtain. Miscommunications blurred the clarity of purpose, and still everyone believed, quietly, firmly, that nothing catastrophic could occur. They trusted the machine. They trusted the instructions. They trusted that the atom, tamed by human hands, would behave. Shortly before 1:24 a.m., the reactor's power level had dipped much lower than intended. Attempts to raise it set off a chain of imbalances. Steam pockets forming within fuel channels, control rods that re-entered too slowly, a design flaw known but buried beneath paperwork and assumptions. In the control room, men stood over panels blinking an orange they had seen many times before. They were concerned, yes, but not afraid. Not yet. Their voices remained calm as they tried to reverse the drift. The plant was strong. The systems were resilient. A reactor does not simply explode. At 1:23:40 a.m., someone pressed a button meant to shut everything down, to calm the reactor into stillness. Instead, it was the final gesture in a sequence that had been building like a quiet storm beneath the surface. For a fraction of a second, the reactor's heart surged with energy it could not contain. Fuel rods fractured, water flashed instantly into steam. Pressure built with the force of hundreds of tons. And then, at 1:23:58 a.m., the night was split open. The first explosion tore through the upper structure, sending a blast of fire, metal, and graphite into the sky. It wasn't a roar so much as a deep, rupturing exhale, a sound like the earth itself cracking open. A second explosion followed, brighter, louder, sending a column of burning debris upward in a plume that glowed blue. Those who saw it later described it as a silent sunrise, a color that didn't belong to nature, a light so eerie it seemed almost beautiful. In Pripyat, windows trembled from the shock. A few residents woke, rubbed their eyes, and went back to sleep, assuming it was thunder from a distant storm. Others stepped out onto balconies, watching the strange glow at the plant's horizon, whispering to one another in puzzled tones. Children stirred in their beds. Dogs barked at shadows. But the city, unaware of the danger drifting invisibly through the air, remained largely still. Closer to the reactor, chaos had begun. Firefighters raced toward the plant without hesitation, unaware of what they were moving into. They rode in engines that rattled and clattered along the dark road, rubber boots tucked beneath them, helmets catching glints of blue from the burning core ahead. When they arrived, they saw flames licking the roof, pieces of glowing graphite scattered like embers from some cosmic fireplace. They stepped on the debris with their bare hands, unaware of the invisible burn searing into their skin. They carried hoses toward fires they thought were ordinary, chemical, electrical, structural. What they didn't know was that the graphite beneath their feet emitted radiation many thousands times stronger than anything previously measured. Yet they moved with a heroism that felt almost quiet. No grand gestures, no speeches, just the instinct to protect, to respond, to do the work.
Some would later recall the taste of metal in their mouths, others the warmth on their faces, like standing too close to the sun. They poured water onto the flames, their voices echoing in the concrete canyons of the plant, calling to one another, encouraging one another. One firefighter would later say that the night felt strangely peaceful, as if the world had slowed down. He remembered thinking the colors were beautiful. As dawn approached, Pripyat began to wake. Children pulled on their school uniforms. Workers prepared for shifts. Parents made breakfast, unaware that the dust settling on their windowsills carried the weight of devastation. The air smelled faintly of burning, but the sky looked clear. People walked outside, curious about the commotion at the plant. Some stood on bridges to get a better view, watching smoke rise in a long, lazy plume. A blue shimmer hovered above the ruins of the reactor, almost like an aurora. Doctors at the local hospital were puzzled when the first firefighters arrived with symptoms they couldn't explain. Burns that didn't look like burns, nausea without cause, confusion, weakness. More men arrived, collapsing into beds. Nurses moved quickly, but confusion grew. No one yet understood what had happened. The information was hidden behind layers of bureaucracy, fear, uncertainty. The city carried on, breathing in what it could not see. By midday, officials began to understand. Not in full, but enough to realize that something impossible had occurred. A reactor core, something designed never to fail, had been destroyed. Radiation levels surged so high that meters jammed at their maximum readings. The ground shimmered with contamination. The breeze carried particles through open windows, onto laundry lines, across schoolyards where children played. Yet still the city waited for instruction. Hours passed, then more hours. Families ate lunch. People went shopping. The distant plume continued to rise. Finally, the order came. Evacuate. No one was told it would be forever. Buses lined the streets in long, solemn rows. Families boarded with small bags, expecting to return by evening, or perhaps the next day. Pets were left behind, doors locked, but not carefully, as though everything was temporary. Children pressed their faces to windows as the buses rolled away, watching their playground shrink into the distance. Pripyat faded gently from life, its silence growing with each passing mile. Within days, the city stood empty. Apartments remained exactly as they had been. Newspapers on tables, toys on floors, plates drying near sinks. Ferris wheels assembled for an upcoming holiday stayed motionless, their bright paint gleaming beneath a sky now heavy with dust. A kindergarten classroom held tiny shoes lined up beneath cubbies, each pair waiting for a child who would never return. Grass grew through cracks in sidewalks. Birds settled on balconies.
Over the years, trees would begin to reclaim the spaces where people had once lived, their branches reaching through broken windows, turning apartments into forests. The disaster spread far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. Maps of Europe slowly darkened as scientists tracked the drift of radioactive clouds. Farm fields in distant countries were contaminated. Livestock was culled. Children across the continent were told to stay indoors as rain carried invisible particles to the ground. The world watched as the reality unfolded. Something had happened that no one had believed possible. International confidence in nuclear power wavered. Protests rose. Governments reassessed safety. Engineers pored over data, realizing that the design flaws, the human errors, the political pressures had woven together into a catastrophe that could have been prevented. Trust in institutions fractured. Trust in technology faltered. Trust in leadership crumbled. What had once been a shining symbol of Soviet progress became a ghost of metal and concrete, glowing faintly with reminders of its own destruction. In the months that followed, thousands of workers, liquidators as they were called, arrived to clean, bury, contain. They moved with a grim determination, understanding the risks, yet driven by duty, necessity, or the hope of protecting future generations. They scraped radioactive soil, demolished homes, built the massive sarcophagus that would entomb the reactor for decades. Their footsteps marked a landscape that no longer belonged to humans, a place that felt suspended between past and future. Pripyat itself transformed into a quiet monument. Trees grew taller, buildings cracked under winter snows. Foxes patrolled the empty streets. Deer wandered through grocery aisles. Wolves made dens beneath stairwells. Life in its mysterious resilience returned even as human life withdrew. Yet something about Chernobyl remained haunting, not just because of what was lost, but because of the tenderness of what remained. A child's doll lying in a hallway, a piano missing a few keys, a swing set rusting slowly as seasons passed. The echoes of conversations, laughter, footsteps, all of them suspended in the stillness. The tragedy was not merely the explosion, nor even the radiation that spread across continents. It was the shattering of trust, the reminder that technology, no matter how advanced, carries within it the fragility of its creators. A single oversight, a single flaw, a single moment of misjudgment can ripple outward, reshaping history. As years turned into decades, the exclusion zone became a strange sanctuary. Scientists studied the return of wildlife. Tourists, carefully monitored, walked through abandoned streets, listening to the wind sigh through broken windows. Chernobyl became a symbol, not just of disaster, but of reflection, a place where humanity could contemplate the balance between progress and humility, ambition and caution. The world changed that night, not because the sky lit up with a blue glow, but because it forced us to recognize the delicate line between control and chaos. The quietest nights, the most ordinary moments, can harbor the weight of unimaginable consequences. And yet, in the stillness of the abandoned city, there is also a strange kind of peace, a reminder that even in the aftermath of tragedy, life continues, slowly, quietly, finding its way back. And even the quietest nights can change the world.
There's a strange quiet that follows stories like these. A quiet that doesn't demand anything from you. It simply settles. These moments we've wandered through, fires, floods, plagues,
loss were terrible days in human history. Days shaped by fear, by confusion, by the sudden unraveling of worlds that once felt certain. And yet, each one carries something else too. A thread woven through the darkness, almost invisible unless you look closely enough. It's the thread of what we learned, how we rebuilt, how we remembered. No tragedy stands alone. Each one leaves echoes, warnings, lessons, stories that help guide us through the centuries that follow. We are shaped by the moments that came before us, no matter how long ago they burned or how quietly they slipped into the collective memory. Humanity has a way of continuing, even after nights that seemed impossible to survive. Cities rise again, families rebuild, knowledge grows back, piece by piece. Forests reclaim the places we leave behind, and new generations walk streets once emptied by fear. Even the deepest wounds slowly soften with time, not forgotten, but transformed. And maybe that's the quiet miracle that ties all of these moments together, not the tragedy, but the endurance that followed. As we drift back toward the present, you might feel your breath easing, the way the mind slowly unclenches when a long journey ends. Let the weight of these stories settle. Let them rest exactly where they belong, safely behind you like distant lanterns glowing on a path you've already traveled. Feel the room around you again, the softness of the air, the rhythm of your breathing, the gentle steadiness of now. History can be heavy, but it can also be grounding. It reminds us how small we are in the vast river of time, and yet how meaningful our moments can be. If you're listening in bed, maybe the darkness feels a little calmer now. If you're walking or sitting somewhere quiet, maybe the world around you feels just a bit more still. Wherever you are, let a slow breath in and a slower breath out guide you back from these stories into your own life, your own night. Wherever you're listening from, know that these moments we visited tonight are part of a much larger tapestry, one we're all still weaving. The past is full of shadows, but it's also full of light. Every loss taught someone how to prepare better. Every failure pushed someone to understand more deeply. Every silence, every ruined page, every collapsed roof or glowing horizon carried within it a lesson that someone, somewhere, chose to remember. And tonight, you remembered them too. Let the past settle. Let it become quiet again, like a book gently closing. You don't need to hold on to the heaviness, only the understanding. A rest belongs to time. Thank you for wandering through history tonight, for listening, for letting these stories breathe again, softly, in the dark. May your night be peaceful, your thoughts be gentle, and your own story continue with calm and curiosity. And when you're ready, you can simply rest.